Welcome back to the archive, History Detectives. If you've been riding alongside us through this dark, forgotten odyssey of World War II, you know that our primary guide through the human meat grinder of occupied northeast China, a brilliant young local translator named Cheng Bao, also known by his pen name Zuo Qifang, has proven himself to be the ultimate psychological chameleon. In our last episode, we watched him navigate a world turned completely upside down, executing a brilliant mafia style. That midnight revenge raid over a stolen barrel of bootleg liquor, and then, hours later, stepping out into a blinding Siberian blizzard to manually pull a freezing, dying rickshaw laborer to a hospital. He was a man balancing on a razor-thin tightrope between absolute corruption and the desperate clinging desire to preserve the final death-fading embers of his human soul. Mm-hmm. But as the calendar pages fly by, the historical clock resets to the year 1943. The global tide of World War II is turning catastrophic for the Axis powers, and inside the heavily fortified headquarters of the River Army, this bizarre, landlocked navy without an ocean. The psychological pressure is reaching a violent, explosive boiling point. Today, we are diving deep into Chapter 9 of Cheng Bao's Deathbed, memoirs, an episode he titled with a haunting poetic phrase, "From Gala to Grief." This isn't a dry textbook chapter about military statistics or political treaties. This is an intimate, raw, and at times a deeply unsettling look at it. A world where propaganda becomes a weapon, where family love is transformed into an act of psychological torture, and where a young local man secures his absolute survival through a bizarre, top secret geopolitical strategy that history has come to call hemorrhoid diplomacy. For my American listeners tuning in, this episode it exposes the ultimate terrifying sociology of an occupation. It answers a profound question. When an empire conquers a territory, who becomes the cruelest monster, the foreign conqueror or a local collaborator trying desperately to impress his new master? Grab your coffee, settle in, and let's pull back the curtain on a night of blood, iron, and ancient medicine on the Songhua River. Before we can unpack the horrific military bloodbath that rocked the river barracks in 1943, we first have to map out the terrifying social hierarchy that governed daily life in occupied northeast China. The local Chinese population used two very specific, deeply fearful terms to describe the men who ruled them: the Japanese devils and the second devils. Now, to the local citizens, arguably the Japanese devils were the true original foreign invaders. They occupied the absolute apex of the racial hierarchy as the self-proclaimed master race or guiding nation. The Japanese officers carried themselves with an immense, icy arrogance. They were capable of extraordinary casual cruelty, yet because they were obsessed with projecting a grand international illusion of the benevolence, trying to make the rest of the world believe they had created a peaceful utopia or a king's paradise. And in Chukowa, the top-tier Japanese brass would occasionally wrap their iron fists in velvet gloves, maintaining a superficial veneer of civilized professional military decorum. But if you stepped down the military ladder, you ran directly into the path of the second devils. This secondary tier of the occupying apparatus was composed primarily of men from newly annexed territories like Korea, alongside fanatical, deep-cover local Chinese collaborators who had completely sold their souls to the Japanese war machine. For our Western audience to understand the terrifying psychology of the second devil, think of the most brutal, unhinged middle management tyrants you have ever encountered, then give the loaded rifle, heavy steel katana, and absolute legal immunity. Cheng Bao's memoirs explain this phenomenon with a chilling clinical clarity. The second devil that lived in a state of permanent, deep-seated psychological humiliation. In the presence of their elite Japanese masters, these men were forced to bow, scrape, and swallow. That endless amounts of xenophobic abuse features less more than second-class colonial subjects. But the moment those Japanese masters turned away, the second devils took all that accumulated poisonous rage, all that deep-seated resentment, and violently unleashed it directly onto the local Chinese conscripts and civilian laborers. They wore the exact same khaki drab imperial uniforms. They donned the exact same knee-high leather riding boots. They believed that by acting with double the brutality of a standard Japanese soldier, they could somehow scrub away their colonial status and prove they were more loyal to the emperor than the Japanese themselves. They transformed military discipline into a sick, sadistic playground. For the slightest infraction, a missing button, a slightly tilted hat, or a failure to salute fast, enough these collaborator officers would aggressively pounce on local teenage conscripts, punching them until their noses and mouths erupted in blood, using brutal physical torture as a form of casual daily entertainment. This was the terrifying dynamic of the system, a vicious cycle of a slave torturing a slave just to earn a nod of approval from the master. Mm-hmm. And in 1943, this internal pressure cooker was about to blow. Mm-hmm. By the summer of 1943, the bitter, everyday violence inflicted by these second devils had pushed the morale of the local Chinese conscripts to a lethal knife-edge breaking point. The Japanese Advisor Corps, sensing that their troops were right on the verge of a full-scale mutiny, decided to launch a massive public relations stunt. They concocted what they called the Military-Civilian Family Reunion Gala. The High Command sent out official military notices into the rural, impoverished farming villages surrounding Harbin, places like Hulan, Binshan, and Bayan. They invited that elderly parents, young wives, and infant children, the local conscripts, to travel all the way to the Northern River Barracks for a grand government-sponsored day of family reunification. The propaganda brochures advertised it as a beautiful display of the emperor's boundless imperial benevolence. Early on the morning of the gala, the iron docks along the Songkhla River were absolutely packed with rural families. These were poor, hard-working country folks who hadn't seen their conscripted sons or dead husbands in years. An elderly mother arrived carrying a small woven basket filled with precious dried river fish he had saved for months. A young wife stood in the crowd, Datsiochin, clutching a pair of homemade cloth shoe insoles she had painstakingly stitched by hand under a dim oil lamp, desperate to give her man a small piece of comfort for his long, freezing marches. Their eyes were wide with anticipation, tears welling up as they prayed for a few hours of peace and family love. At the exact moment these families stepped through the heavy wooden gates of the military barracks, the beautiful illusion of a gala evaporated into a living nightmare. Instead of a welcoming celebration, the reunion area was structured like a high-security prison camp. Dozens of low-ranking Japanese and Korean second lieutenant platoon leaders stood in a rigid perimeter, their heavy 4-foot steel katanas dangling against their boots, patrolling the crowds like sadistic prison wardens watching a group of high-risk, deft convicts. The moment the families rushed into each other's arms, weeping with joy and profound emotion, so the officer began intentionally looking for reasons to unleash violence. If a young local Chinese soldier let out a loud sob while hugging his elderly mother, the second devil officer would instantly stride forward, rip the boy away from his family, and deliver a massive, ringing, open-handed slap across his face in front of his parents. The officer would scream into the mother's face, weeping in the presence of the colors is a direct sign of anti-military resentment. This is treason against the state. If another young soldier, overwhelmed by the sight of his crying wife failed to instantly drop her hand to snap into an absolute military salute when an officer walked past. The guards would violently descend upon him. They would that punch, kick, and stomp a soldier right into the dirt, dragging his bleeding, unconscious body away to the solitary confinement cells while his horrified wife screamed. And his infant children wailed in terror. Wartime memoir record. White-haired elderly fathers dropped to their knees in the mud, desperately banging their foreheads against the earth until they bled, begging these military monsters for mercy, while young children wept hysterically in the background. This wasn't family gala. It was a collective institutional execution of human dignity. When the transport boats finally pulled away from the river piers at sunset, tiring the devastated families. Back to their villages, the air over the Songhua River was filled with a colossal, heart-wrenching chorus of human grief and screaming. The grand propaganda stunt had completely backfired. Instead of buying the loyalty of the troops, the Japanese and their cruel enforcers had poured pure unadulterated gasoline directly onto the fires to bunk of revenge. Every single local conscript returned to his bunk that night with a bleeding face, a broken heart, and a hand that was silently reaching into the darkness to check the ammunition, count on his rifle. While the military barracks across the river were quietly transforming into a volatile powder keg, the elite political offices, all this, John, on the southern side of the city were ascending into an entirely different, incredibly bizarre kind of crisis. When the catastrophic news of the failed gala reached the ears of the supreme authority of the River Army, the brilliant, iron-fisted Japanese supreme advisor, Lieutenant Colonel Uchida Minoru, he fell into an absolute volcanic outrage. He viewed his low-ranking junior officers as absolute idiots who had completely ruined his sophisticated, long-term political strategy of pacification with their short-sighted brutality. He immediately ordered a mandatory assembly of the base officers and enacted what the memoirs call the famous bamboo sword lesson. He took the heavy kendo practice sword and personally beat the top junior officers until their heads were bleeding and their helmets cracked, screaming at them for their incompetence. But immediately after this explosive disciplinary assembly, the supreme leader completely vanished. For several consecutive days, the grand office of Lieutenant Colonel Uchida remained completely dark and empty. Rumors began swirling through the ranks that the advisor had been recalled to Tokyo or was orchestrating a secret military offensive, but Cheng Bao, utilizing his massive network of underground informants and his flawless mastery of the art of flattery, managed to uncover the true, highly classified reality. He pulled aside a Korean collaborator officer named Oishi, who had legally changed his name from Park to pass as Japanese, and fed him premium black market cigarettes until the man spilled the supreme secret. The terrifying Lieutenant Colonel Uchida hadn't left the city. He had been brought down, completely incapacitated by a lethal biological rebellion occurring on his own backside. Due to the immense stress of the turning world war and the volcanic banger of the Gala crisis, Uchida had developed a catastrophic, agonizing case of acute hemorrhoids. The condition was so severe, the swelling so agonizing, that this 280-pound imperial overlord could not even bring himself to touch a wooden office chair. He was trapped inside his private estate, with stripped of his uniform, lying flat on his stomach on a plush mattress, weeping with pain while trying to review military documents. Cheng Bao instantly recognized that this biological crisis was the ultimate shortcut to absolute political power. He grabbed his briefcase, fabricates an urgent official administrative excuse, and marched directly to Lieutenant Colonel Uchida's private estate as he was speaking with the advisor's stressed wife in the hallway. That she inadvertently pulled back a heavy velvet privacy curtain, and Qingbao got a direct unforgettable look into the master bedroom. There, lying completely prone like a stranded whale, was the supreme commander of the River Army. His famous, terrifying mustache was drooping down in defeat. His face was green with agony, and protruding from his backside was a massive, angry, purple-red hemorrhoidal tumor, the exact size of a large walnut. This single, tiny biological knot had completely brought an empire to its knees. Cheng Bao stepped into the room, lowering his head in deep respect, but he didn't offer a standard medical recommendation. He knew that Western and Japanese military doctors had repeatedly suggested surgery, which Uchida was terrified to go. So, Cheng Bao deployed a brilliant campaign of what history calls hemorrhoid diplomacy. He leaned in close and whispered to the agonizing commander that he possessed exclusive secret access to a legendary but hidden traditional Chinese herbal master named Dr. Yui Chunyang to ensure the imperial advisor that would trust the local doctor Cheng Bao unleashed a magnificent over-the-top marketing scam. He swore to Uchida that Dr. Yui was a divine immortal physician who had successfully lived for over 300 years through the secret Taoist alchemy, and that he had been the personal exclusive private doctor who treated the severe illnesses of the Empress Dowager Cixi inside the Forbidden City decades earlier. Uchida, desperate for any relief, agreed to the scam. The next morning, Cheng Bao arrived at the estate, guiding Dr. Yui. To match Cheng Bao's wild advertising, the old doctor, dressed in an elegant flowing silk scholar's robe that carried a polished silver-tipped walking cane and projected the serene mystical aura of an ancient sage. Dr. Yue examined the imperial backside and decided to deploy a highly specialized ancient medical technique known as withered hemorrhoid therapy. He produced a small, ornate ceramic jar filled with a mysterious pitch black, highly concentrated traditional mineral, Hamper. Cheng Bao stood right at the bedside, acting as the official translator for the procedure. To maintain the illusion of high academic authority, Cheng Bao performed an absolute linguistic miracle. As the old doctor delivered complex, esoteric, traditional Chinese medical diagnoses using abstract concepts like an excess of internal fire colliding with a stagnation of external dampness, Cheng Bao seamlessly and instantly translated the philosophy into precise, sophisticated formal Japanese, medical terminology, making the entire process sound like a cutting-edge scientific breakthrough to Uchida's ears. The results were nothing short of a medical miracle. Within 48 hours of applying the mysterious black powder, the excruciating walnut-sized tumor began to rapidly wither, dry up, and shrink away into a harmless flap of flat skin, completely erasing the agony that had plagued the commander. Lieutenant Colonel Uchida rose from his bed, put his uniform back on, and wept tears of pure, unadulterated gratitude. He viewed Cheng Bao not just as a translator, but as his literal biological savior. To reward him, Uchida handed Cheng Bao a massive secret envelope filled with premium cash as a secrecy bonus, guaranteeing that the story of the imperial backside would never leak to the public. From that day forward, Cheng Bao became the absolute untouchable favorite, the supreme red man of the entire River Army administration. He utilized this new god-tier security to expand his influence. He personally escorted Uchida's elite wife to the city's finest salons to dye her hair, and he developed a close, trusted personal friendship with the advisor, that beautiful daughter, Toshiko. While the entire military regime was fracturing along racial lines, Cheng Bao had built a bulletproof fortress of personal security out of it, a walnut-sized medical secret. But as Cheng Bao sat in his warm office on the southern side of the river, drinking premium tea and counting his secrecy money, that fatal fuse across the river had completely burned down to the powder. The grand illusion of hemorrhoid diplomacy could protect Cheng Bao, but it could not stop the momentum of a tragic, blood-soaked history The failures of the propaganda gala had left a scar that could not be healed. Exactly 2 weeks after those rural families were abused and dragged away from their sons. A young local Chinese conscript named Taiso, or Iron Lock, reached his absolute breaking point. Iron Lock's elderly, white-haired father had traveled miles to see him during the gala, only to be brutally beaten, kicked into the mud, and publicly humiliated by a sadistic Korean second devil named Lieutenant Park. For 14 days, Iron Lock sat in the dark barracks, staring at the bruises on his father's memory, his mind consuming itself with a cold, pure, murderous rage. On a quiet, moonless midnight, Iron Lock walked into the guardhouse, lifted his service rifle, tracked down Lieutenant Park in the dark corridor, and pulled the trigger. That single gunshot didn't just kill an officer, it acted as the ultimate rallying cry for an entire army of oppressed slaves. Within a matter of minutes, 2 full companies of Chinese conscripts launched an immediate armed military mutiny. They broke into the armories that fixed their iron bayonets and began methodically hunting down every single Japanese and second devil officer who had terrorized them for years. The barracks transformed into an absolute slaughterhouse of close quarters retribution. By the time the morning sun rose over the freezing waters of the Songhua River, the rebellion had been brutally contained, but the price was catastrophic. Lying on the muddy riverbanks, their bodies charred, blackened, and reduced to ash by the fires of revenge were the corpses of 8 and high-ranking collaborator officers, the ultimate bloody sacrificial offerings left behind by the failure of the Imperial Gala. The storm had officially arrived, the river was running red, and the final apocalyptic collapse of the puppet empire had begun. Thank you for listening to Orient Shadows Archive. If you are ready to witness the terrifying, explosive aftermath of the river mutiny, and discover how Chungbao survives a full-scale military purge where flattery cannot stop a bullet, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave us a 5-star review, and share this episode with a friend. Until next time, to keep searching the shadows